My name is Jake Martinez, and the day I discovered what my mother had been hiding in that locked basement room, I stood surrounded by 27 years of lies, holding a lighter in one hand and watching my entire childhood crumble into ash. The smell of burning paper mixed with the scent of her lavender perfume still clinging to the walls, and for the first time since her funeral 3 months ago, I finally understood why she never let anyone go downstairs. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but others burn so bright they illuminate everything you thought you knew about the people who raised you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flames danced higher as I fed document after document into the metal barrel I'd dragged into our backyard on Maple Street, each page revealing another layer of deception so carefully constructed it would have impressed me if it hadn't destroyed me first. My sister Sarah had been calling all morning, demanding to know why I wasn't answering her texts about dividing Mom's belongings. But how do you explain that the woman who raised us had been living 3 separate lives, and we were only props in one of them? Growing up in the Martinez household meant understanding your place in the carefully orchestrated symphony that was Elena Martinez's life. My mother had immigrated to Riverside with my grandmother when she was 16, worked her way through night school while cleaning offices downtown, and eventually landed a position as a secretary at Roosevelt Elementary, where she spent the next 30 years becoming the kind of woman everyone called dependable. She had soft brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled, calloused hands from decades of filing and typing, and a voice that never rose above what was necessary to be heard. Sarah, my older sister by 3 years, inherited Mom's natural grace and her ability to navigate social situations like she was born knowing the rules. Even as kids, Sarah could walk into any room and within minutes have every adult eating out of her palm. She had our mother's smooth olive skin and thick black hair that always fell perfectly no matter what she did to it, and this innate understanding of what people wanted to hear that made her impossible not to like. Teachers loved her, neighbors asked about her accomplishments, and by high school she was already talking about becoming a real estate agent because she understood that people bought dreams, not just houses. I was different from the start, quieter and more observant, the kind of kid who noticed things others missed but struggled to articulate why those details mattered. Where Sarah sparkled in conversations, I absorbed information, filing away inconsistencies and patterns that didn't quite align. My mother used to say I had my father's analytical mind, though I barely remembered him since he died in a construction accident when I was 12. What I did remember was how Mom changed after his death, becoming more guarded, more protective of her privacy, more insistent that some parts of adult life weren't meant for children to understand. The house on Maple Street became our fortress after Dad died, a 1960s ranch-style home with faded yellow siding and an overgrown garden that Mom never had time to properly maintain. Sarah helped with the social aspects of keeping up appearances, chatting with neighbors over the fence, and making sure we looked like a normal grieving family, while I retreated into books and spent hours exploring every corner of our property except the basement. That was Mom's domain, the one place she'd explicitly told us never to go, not because it was dangerous but because it contained things that belonged to grown-ups. Sarah never questioned the boundary because she was busy excelling at everything else, maintaining perfect grades while working part-time at the local department store and dating the captain of the basketball team. She had a natural confidence that made rules seem optional, except when it came to Mom's basement, which she accepted with the same easy compliance she brought to everything that didn't directly affect her social standing. I, on the other hand, spent years wondering what could possibly be down there that required such absolute secrecy, but I respected Mom's authority enough to never push. Our childhood wasn't defined by what was missing but by what was carefully controlled. Mom attended every school event, packed our lunches with notes written in her neat handwriting, and made sure we had everything we needed to succeed, but there was always this sense that she was performing motherhood rather than simply being our mother. She asked about our days and celebrated our achievements, but rarely shared stories about her own life before we were born, deflecting personal questions with gentle redirections back to whatever we were doing. The differences between Sarah and me became more pronounced as we got older, not because we didn't care about each other, but because we occupied entirely different universes within the same house. Sarah thrived on external validation and social connection, building networks of friendships that would eventually serve her well in real estate, while I gravitated toward solitary pursuits that allowed me to think without interruption. By the time I was in high school, I'd developed an interest in journalism, spending hours at the Riverside Public Library, researching stories and learning how to ask questions that revealed truth rather than just confirming what people wanted to believe. Mom supported both our interests with equal enthusiasm, driving Sarah to networking events and real estate seminars, while helping me apply for journalism scholarships, but I noticed she was always more comfortable with Sarah's chosen path. Real estate was straightforward, social, and kept you connected to your community, while journalism involved asking uncomfortable questions and potentially uncovering information people preferred to keep private. She never discouraged my ambitions, but I sensed her relief when I decided to attend UC Riverside instead of accepting offers from schools in other states. Sarah, meanwhile, had no desire to leave Riverside at all. She'd spent her teenage years building relationships with local business owners and community leaders, understanding instinctively that success in real estate depended more on who you knew than what you knew. By the time she graduated from high school, she already
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
had a job lined up with the most successful agency in town, working under Tom Bradley, a man who'd been selling houses in Riverside for 20 years, and appreciated Sarah's combination of charm and ambition. College was where the fundamental differences between us became impossible to ignore. Sarah stayed home, commuting to the local community college for her real estate license, while working full-time and building her client base, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of life in Riverside. I moved into the dorms, despite living only 15 minutes from campus, eager to experience independence and engage with ideas that challenged everything I thought I understood about the world. My journalism professors encouraged critical thinking and skepticism, teaching me to question official narratives and look for the stories hiding behind the stories everyone else was telling. During those 4 years, I'd come home for dinner once a week and major holidays, but even those brief visits felt increasingly strained. Not because of any conflict or animosity, but because we were growing in different directions and losing the shared reference points that had connected us as children. Sarah would update me on her latest sales achievements and the local gossip she'd gathered from her clients, while I'd share whatever investigative piece I was working on for the college paper, and Mom would nod politely at both of us, while steering conversation toward safer topics like upcoming family birthdays or neighborhood events. The basement remained off-limits throughout my college years, though by then I'd mostly forgotten to wonder about it. I had my own mysteries to solve, stories about city council corruption and campus administration cover-ups that felt more immediate and important than whatever Mom might be keeping in storage downstairs. Sarah had moved into her own apartment by then, a stylish one-bedroom near downtown that she'd gotten at below-market rent through her real estate connections, and our weekly family dinners became monthly check-ins that maintained connection without requiring deeper intimacy. After graduation, I took a job with the Riverside Press Enterprise, starting as a general assignment reporter covering city meetings and local events, while pitching longer investigative pieces to editors who seemed perpetually overworked and under-resourced. The pay was terrible, and the hours were unpredictable, but I loved the work, especially the process of gathering information from multiple sources and assembling it into narratives that revealed hidden truths about how power operated in our community. Mom was proud, though I could tell she worried about me making enemies among the local business and political leaders Sarah counted as clients. Sarah's career, meanwhile, was flourishing in ways that impressed everyone who knew her. She'd quickly become one of the top producers at Bradley Real Estate, specializing in helping families find their dream homes while building relationships that extended far beyond individual transactions. Her clients became friends, her friends became clients, and within 5 years, she'd established herself as someone who could get things done in Riverside's tight-knit community. She bought a house 3 blocks from where we'd grown up, a beautifully renovated craftsman bungalow that she'd secured through an off-market deal, and transformed into something worthy of a home design magazine. Our mother aged gracefully through her 60s, retiring from Roosevelt Elementary with a small pension and settling into a comfortable routine of volunteer work at Sacred Heart Community Center, weekly coffee dates with neighbors, and Sunday dinners that brought Sarah and me together at least once a month. She seemed content, maybe even happy, though I noticed she'd become even more private about her past as she got older, deflecting questions about her childhood in Mexico or her early years in Riverside, with the same gentle but firm redirections she'd mastered when we were kids. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March, when Maria Rodriguez, our next-door neighbor for 20 years, called to say she hadn't seen Mom for 3 days and was getting worried. I drove over immediately, using the spare key I'd kept since college, and found her collapsed in the kitchen, conscious but unable to speak clearly or move her right arm. The stroke had been massive, the doctor at Riverside General explained, affecting multiple areas of her brain and leaving her with limited mobility and communication abilities that might never fully recover. Sarah and I spent the next 6 weeks taking shifts at the hospital, watching Mom struggle through physical therapy sessions and speech exercises that yielded minimal improvement. The woman who had managed our household with quiet efficiency and maintained her independence well into her 70s was suddenly dependent on others for the most basic tasks, and the frustration in her eyes was heartbreaking to witness. She could understand everything we said, but couldn't find words to respond, communicating primarily through gestures and expressions that we learned to interpret with varying degrees of success. The end came suddenly on a Thursday evening in late April. Sarah and I had both been at the hospital earlier that day, but I'd gone home to shower and change clothes while she stayed to have dinner with Mom. The call came at 9:30, Sarah's voice hollow with exhaustion, as she told me Mom had suffered another stroke during the evening news and was gone before the nurses could stabilize her. I drove back to the hospital in a state of suspended disbelief, not quite able to process that the woman who had been the constant center of our lives for 3 decades was simply no longer there. The funeral at St. Mary's Catholic Church was packed with people whose lives Mom had touched over the years, former students and their parents, colleagues from Roosevelt Elementary, neighbors who remembered her kindness during difficult times, and dozens of others whose connection to our family I couldn't immediately identify. Sarah handled the social aspects with her usual grace, accepting condolences and sharing memories with a composure I envied, but couldn't replicate. I stood beside her, shaking hands and nodding at appropriate moments, but feeling disconnected from the celebration of Elena Martinez's life that everyone else seemed to be participating in. After the burial at Valley View Cemetery, Sarah and I returned to the house on Maple Street to begin the overwhelming process of sorting through 40 years of accumulated belongings. Mom had been organized in life, but she'd also been a keeper of things, and every closet and drawer contained layers of history that would need to be examined, evaluated, and either preserved or discarded. Sarah approached the task with characteristic efficiency, making piles for donation, sale, and personal keepsakes, while I moved more slowly, reading through old letters and studying photographs that offered glimpses into aspects of Mom's life I'd never known about. It was Sarah who first mentioned the basement, 2 weeks after the funeral, as we were finishing the kitchen and discussing our plan for the remaining rooms. She'd been handling the estate sale arrangements, and wanted to know if there was anything downstairs that might be worth including, furniture or appliances that could bring a decent price. I realized with surprise that in all our years of living in the house, neither of us had ever actually been in Mom's basement, respecting her boundaries so completely that it had become invisible. The door was locked, as it had always been, but Sarah had found Mom's keys in her purse and assumed one of them would fit. It took 3 tries to find the right one, a small brass key that turned easily in the old lock, and when the door swung open, we were greeted by darkness and the faint smell of lavender perfume that had been Mom's signature scent for as long as I could remember. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight as Sarah and I descended into what I had always imagined was a typical basement storage area, flashlights in hand, because neither of us could locate a light switch near the entrance. The beam of my phone's flashlight swept across concrete walls and revealed something that made both of us stop moving entirely. This wasn't a basement storage room at all. It was an office, complete with filing cabinets, a desk, computer equipment, and what appeared to be a sophisticated organizational system that had been maintained with the same meticulous care Mom brought to everything else in her life. Sarah found the light switch after feeling along the wall for several seconds, and when fluorescent bulbs flickered to life overhead, we found ourselves standing in a space that felt like stepping into an alternate dimension. The basement had been converted into a professional workspace sometime in the distant past, with industrial carpeting, painted drywall, and acoustic tiles that suggested whoever used this room needed privacy for phone calls or meetings. A heavy wooden desk dominated one corner, its surface clear except for a leather desk pad, and a brass lamp that looked like it belonged in a law office. The filing cabinets were the kind you'd find in any business office, tall metal units, with locks on each drawer, and labels written in Mom's familiar handwriting. But these weren't labels for household documents or family records. They read things like Riverside Development Associates, Municipal Contracts 2015 to 2018, Property Acquisitions, and Legal Correspondence, terms that meant nothing to me, but seemed to make Sarah increasingly uncomfortable as she read them aloud. Along one wall, Mom had installed floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled not with novels or cookbooks, but with reference materials about real estate law, municipal planning codes, environmental regulations, and business management. Interspersed among the technical manuals were 3 ring binders with dates spanning back 15 years, each one thick with documents that had been hole-punched and organized with the kind of systematic precision that suggested regular use rather than mere storage. The computer setup was equally puzzling. Mom had never shown any interest in technology beyond the basic email and web browsing. She'd learned to help with her job at Roosevelt Elementary, yet here was a desktop system with multiple monitors, a scanner, a printer, and external hard drives that indicated someone who worked extensively with digital files. The computer was password protected, but the monitors were large enough that Sarah and I could see multiple desktop folders with names like RDA Financial Records, Riverside City Planning, and Property Research Database. Sarah walked to the filing cabinets and tried several drawer handles, finding them all locked, except for one marked Personal Records, that slid open to reveal hanging folders with our names, birth certificates, school records, medical files, and other family documentation that made sense to keep in a home office. But underneath the predictable family papers were folders labeled with names I didn't recognize, business entities with official-sounding titles that seemed completely disconnected from anything I knew about Mom's life or interests. I was examining the bookshelf when I noticed something that made my stomach clench with unease. Behind a row of books about municipal finance, someone had carved a small rectangular opening in the drywall, just large enough to accommodate what appeared to be a wall safe. The safe itself was old, probably installed decades ago, with a combination dial and handle that looked like something from a bank vault. It was the kind of security feature you'd install if you had valuable documents or items that needed protection beyond what a simple locked filing cabinet could provide. The discovery of the safe changed the entire atmosphere in the room. What had felt like curiosity about Mom's private workspace suddenly felt like trespassing in someone else's secret life. Sarah and I looked at each other without speaking, both of us processing the implications of what we'd found. Our mother, the school secretary who volunteered at church and made casseroles for grieving neighbors, had maintained a basement office equipped with business-grade technology and a wall safe that suggested she'd been involved in activities that required serious security precautions. Sarah was the first to voice what we were both thinking. She asked if I had any idea what Mom could have been doing down here, and whether this had anything to do with why she'd always been so insistent that the basement was off limits. I didn't have answers, but I was starting to formulate questions that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Why would a retired elementary school secretary need multiple filing cabinets full of real estate and municipal documents? Why did she have a computer system that looked like something from a professional consulting firm? And what was valuable enough to keep in a wall safe that she'd never mentioned to either of her children? We decided to approach the mystery systematically, starting with the unlocked filing cabinet and working our way through whatever information we could access without breaking into secured areas. Sarah took the initiative, pulling out the first hanging folder and spreading its contents across Mom's desk while I examined the computer setup more closely. The folder contained property deeds for addresses throughout Riverside, photocopies of building permits, and correspondence between various real estate developers and city officials about zoning changes and construction approvals. None of the properties listed in the documents were familiar to me, and none were connected to our family's address on Maple Street. But as Sarah read through the correspondence, she started finding references to a business entity called Riverside Development Associates that seemed to be involved in multiple real estate transactions throughout the city. The company had apparently been active for at least 15 years, based on the document dates, and it had been successful enough to acquire properties, negotiate with municipal officials, and coordinate complex development projects. I was examining the external hard drives when Sarah called my attention to a letter that made both of us sit down abruptly. It was correspondence between Riverside Development Associates and the law offices of Chen, Williams and Associates, discussing the transfer of several commercial properties and the distribution of profits from a recent development project. The letter was addressed to Elena Martinez, managing partner, and it referenced previous conversations about reinvesting proceeds into additional Riverside area acquisitions. The implications were staggering. Our mother hadn't just been involved with Riverside Development Associates. According to this documentation, she had been running the company. The woman who had worked as a school secretary for 30 years, who lived modestly in a house that needed repairs, she claimed we couldn't afford, who worried about money constantly and taught us to be careful with every dollar, had apparently been managing a real estate development business that was generating enough profit to warrant correspondence with law firms and discussions about reinvestment strategies. Sarah pulled out another folder, while I tried to process what we'd already discovered. This one contained financial statements and bank records for accounts I'd never heard of, showing deposits and withdrawals that suggested significant cash flow over multiple years. The numbers were shocking. Monthly deposits ranging from $20,000 to $60,000, with occasional larger amounts that exceeded what Mom had earned in entire years, working at Roosevelt Elementary. The bank statements went back over a decade, showing consistent income that dwarfed anything we'd associated with our family's financial situation. I started looking through the reference books on Mom's shelves, finding highlighted passages about tax strategies for real estate investments, property development financing, and legal structures for business partnerships. These weren't casual readings. The highlighting and marginal notes indicated someone who had studied these topics intensively and applied the information in practical situations. Several books contained handwritten notes, in Mom's writing, calculations and observations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex financial concepts. The more we discovered, the more I realized how completely I had misunderstood the person who had raised me. This wasn't just about finding unexpected documents or discovering that Mom had business interests we hadn't known about. This was about recognizing that Elena Martinez had been living a double life so expertly constructed that her own children had no awareness of her true financial situation or professional activities. Every conversation about money, every decision about family expenses, every expression of concern about our financial security had been performed against the backdrop of a secret life that contradicted everything she had told us about our circumstances. Sarah found the key to understanding Mom's system in a folder labeled Property Management Summary, which contained a master list of all assets owned or controlled by Riverside Development Associates. The list included commercial buildings, residential rental properties, undeveloped land parcels, and partnership interests in larger development projects throughout Riverside and neighboring communities. Conservative estimates of the portfolio's value, based on recent appraisals contained in the files, suggested total assets exceeding $3 million. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a folder containing correspondence with financial advisors about estate planning and asset protection strategies. The letters discussed methods for transferring business ownership without triggering tax consequences, techniques for maintaining privacy around wealth accumulation, and recommendations for structuring inheritances to minimize legal complications. These weren't theoretical discussions, they were specific plans for what would happen to Riverside Development Associates after Mom's death, plans that had been updated as recently as 6 months before her stroke. According to the estate planning documents, Mom had been working with lawyers to structure the business in a way that would allow Sarah and me to inherit her assets without immediately understanding the full scope of what we were inheriting. The plan involved transferring property ownership into trusts that would generate income for us while keeping the business operations separate and private. It was an elaborate strategy designed to provide for our financial security, while maintaining the secrecy that had apparently been crucial to how Mom operated throughout her adult life. Part 3. The pattern emerges. The revelation that our mother had been secretly wealthy forced Sarah and me to reconsider every conversation we'd ever had about money, every family decision that had been justified by financial constraints, every moment when we'd been taught to be grateful for what we had because resources were limited. I spent the next 3 hours pulling documents from filing cabinets, while Sarah worked through the computer files we could access, and with each new discovery, the scope of Mom's deception became more apparent and more sophisticated. The financial records painted a picture of careful wealth accumulation that had been ongoing since shortly after Dad's death 25 years ago. The first business documents we found were dated just 2 years after the construction accident that killed him, suggesting that Mom had used his life insurance settlement as seed money for real estate investments that had grown exponentially over time. What had started as modest residential property purchases had evolved into a complex portfolio of commercial developments, rental properties, and partnership investments that generated substantial passive income. But the documentation revealed something even more significant than Mom's business success. Riverside Development Associates hadn't been a solo operation. The files contained correspondence with a network of local business owners, city officials, and other investors who had participated in various projects over the years. Mom had been part of an informal consortium of Riverside power brokers who coordinated their investments and leveraged their political connections to secure favorable zoning decisions, tax incentives, and development approvals. The names in these files were familiar from my years covering local government for the press enterprise. Tom Bradley, the real estate agent, who had been Sarah's mentor and boss, appeared frequently in correspondence about property acquisitions and development partnerships. City council members I'd interviewed for various stories were mentioned in emails about upcoming votes on zoning changes and infrastructure projects. The county supervisor, who had been pushing for downtown revitalization, had apparently been coordinating with Mom's group to ensure that their properties would benefit from planned public improvements. Sarah discovered a folder containing meeting minutes from monthly gatherings of this investment group, which they called the Riverside Growth Alliance.
Minutes revealed a level of strategic coordination that bordered on manipulation of the local political process. Members would identify promising properties before they came on the market, research planned municipal projects that might affect property values, and coordinate their positions on city council votes to ensure favorable outcomes for their investments. The meeting minutes also revealed Mom's role within this group. She wasn't just a participant, she was often the one organizing meetings, researching municipal plans, and coordinating the group's strategic responses to political developments. Her job at Roosevelt Elementary had provided perfect cover for these activities, giving her a reason to be informed about city planning decisions and school district real estate needs while maintaining a public profile as a humble school employee with no obvious business interests. Reading through years of meeting minutes, I began to understand how Mom had been able to accumulate wealth so quietly and effectively. The Riverside Growth Alliance had been essentially front-running the city's development plans, purchasing properties before public announcements drove up prices and positioning themselves to benefit from infrastructure improvements funded by taxpayers. It was legal, technically, but it involved a level of insider information and coordinated action that felt ethically questionable at best. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over 20 years, the Riverside Growth Alliance had been involved in virtually every major development project in the city. When the downtown transit center was built, they had purchased surrounding properties months before the project was publicly announced. When the city decided to expand the industrial zone, they had already acquired land parcels that would benefit from the zoning changes. When new residential developments were approved, they were typically developed by alliance members or their business partners. Sarah found email correspondence that showed how the system worked in practice. Mom would receive advance information about city planning decisions through her network of contacts, often weeks or months before the information became public. She would research the implications for property values, identify acquisition opportunities, and coordinate the group's response. Individual members would purchase specific properties based on their analysis, and the group would collectively lobby for municipal decisions that would increase their property values. The financial returns had been extraordinary. Properties purchased for tens of thousands of dollars had been sold for hundreds of thousands after strategic municipal improvements increased their value. Undeveloped land acquired cheaply had been rezoned for commercial use and developed into profitable shopping centers and office buildings. Rental properties purchased in declining neighborhoods had been renovated and gentrified as the city invested in infrastructure improvements that drove up property values. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was how Mom had used her position as a school secretary to advance the group's interests. Roosevelt Elementary was located in an area that had been targeted for redevelopment, and Mom had been providing information about the school district's real estate plans to her investment partners. When the district decided to sell surplus property, alliance members were positioned to submit the winning bids. When new schools were built, they were constructed on land sold by alliance members at substantial profits. The documentation showed that Mom's annual income from Riverside Development Associates had consistently exceeded her salary from the school district by factors of 10 or more. In recent years, as properties were sold and developed, her investment returns had reached levels that placed her among the wealthiest residents of Riverside. Yet she had continued living in the same modest house, driving the same aging car, and expressing concern about family finances as if her school secretary's salary was our only source of security. I found a folder containing tax returns that Mom had prepared for Riverside Development Associates, showing business income and expenses that painted a picture of sophisticated financial management. The returns included depreciation schedules for multiple properties, partnership distributions from development projects, and capital gains from property sales that had been carefully structured to minimize tax obligations. These weren't the tax returns of someone dabbling in real estate investment, they were the documents of a professional property developer who understood complex tax strategies and employed them effectively. Sarah discovered correspondence with financial advisors about diversification strategies and risk management that showed Mom had been thinking about her wealth in institutional terms rather than personal ones. She had been working with investment professionals to structure her holdings in ways that would preserve capital across multiple market cycles, protect assets from potential legal challenges, and generate stable income streams that could support her family indefinitely. The emails with financial advisors also revealed Mom's concerns about maintaining privacy around her wealth. She had specifically requested investment structures that would minimize public disclosure requirements and keep her name off property ownership records whenever possible. The advisors had recommended using limited liability companies, family trusts, and other legal entities to obscure the true ownership of her assets while maintaining her control over investment decisions. Perhaps most shocking was discovering that Mom had been using her position at Roosevelt Elementary to gather intelligence about other families' financial situations. She had access to student records that included family income information, employment data, and home addresses that allowed her to identify potential investment opportunities in specific neighborhoods. When families faced financial difficulties and needed to sell their homes quickly, Mom's investment group was often positioned to make immediate cash offers below market value. The more I read, the more I realized that Mom's entire public persona had been carefully constructed to conceal a level of wealth and influence that would have changed how everyone in Riverside viewed our family. The modest house, the concern about expenses, the emphasis on education and hard work as paths to financial security. All of it had been performance designed to maintain the cover that allowed her business activities to continue undetected. Sarah and I worked through the afternoon and into the evening, trying to comprehend the scope of what we were discovering. By the time we took a break for dinner, we had identified real estate holdings worth over $3 million, business partnerships with most of the prominent developers in Riverside, and investment returns that had made Mom one of the wealthiest women in the city. Yet neither of us had ever suspected that our family had resources beyond what a school secretary's salary could provide. Part 4, The Deeper Truth. The decision to try opening Mom's wall safe came after we'd exhausted all the unlocked filing cabinets and realized that the most sensitive information was probably stored behind the combination lock she'd never shared with anyone. Sarah suggested we try significant dates from family history and adversaries, Dad's death date, while I examined the safe more carefully to understand
what we were dealing with.
It was an older model, probably installed in the 1980s, with a 3-number combination that would require patience and luck to crack without professional help. My third attempt succeeded when I tried Mom's birth date in reverse order, the tumblers clicking into place with satisfying precision. The safe door swung open to reveal a space packed with documents, cash bundles, and what appeared to be additional storage devices containing digital files. The cash alone was stunning. Neat stacks of $100 bills that I estimated totaled at least $50,000, more money than I'd ever seen in one place and certainly more than anyone would keep at home unless they had specific reasons for avoiding banks. But the cash was the least significant discovery in the safe. Underneath the money bundles were 3 manila envelopes, marked with years spanning the past decade, each containing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance records about specific individuals in Riverside's business and political community. The photographs showed various city officials and business leaders in situations that seemed designed to document meetings, relationships, and activities that might be considered compromising if revealed publicly. The first envelope contained materials related to Tom Bradley, Sarah's boss and mentor in real estate. The photographs showed him meeting with developers at restaurants and private clubs, accepting what appeared to be cash payments, and participating in meetings with city council members that weren't part of any official municipal business. The documents included copies of bank records showing deposits that coincided with specific city council votes on zoning changes, suggesting a pattern of payments for political influence that would constitute corruption if verified. Sarah's reaction to discovering this information about Tom was immediate and visible. She'd worked for him for over 7 years, respected him as a mentor, and built her entire real estate career on the foundation he'd provided. Learning that Mom had been documenting what appeared to be corrupt activities involving her boss created a conflict between family loyalty and professional relationships that she struggled to process. The implications for her own career were also troubling, since her success had been built on connections and opportunities provided by someone who might be criminally compromised. The second envelope contained similar materials about David Chen, the lawyer who'd been handling Mom's estate planning and who we'd trusted to guide us through the probate process. The photographs showed Chen meeting with developers and city officials in situations that suggested coordination of legal strategies with political decisions. The documents included copies of legal fees that seemed excessive for routine services, along with records of property transfers that benefited Chen's other clients in ways that might constitute conflicts of interest. But the most disturbing envelope contained materials about Maria Rodriguez, our next-door neighbor for 20 years, and someone I'd always considered a family friend. The photographs showed Maria meeting with representatives from a waste management company that had been seeking city contracts, receiving what appeared to be cash payments, and participating in meetings with other individuals who were connected to various municipal service contracts. The documents suggested that Maria had been using her position on the City Planning Commission to influence contract awards in exchange for financial compensation. The revelation that Mom had been conducting surveillance on people we considered family friends forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about her motivations and methods. This wasn't just about real estate investment or even coordinated influence on municipal policies. This was about systematic collection of compromising information that could be used to manipulate or control other people's behavior. Mom had been building leverage over key individuals in Riverside's power structure, documenting their questionable activities in ways that could destroy their careers if the information became public. Sarah found additional storage devices in the safe that contained digital copies of the surveillance materials, along with audio recordings of conversations that had apparently been captured without the participants' knowledge. The recordings included discussions between city council members about upcoming votes, conversations between developers about strategies for securing favorable zoning decisions, and meetings between business owners about coordinating their responses to municipal policies. The quality of the recordings suggested sophisticated equipment and careful planning to capture these conversations. The scope of Mom's intelligence gathering operation was breathtaking. She had been documenting the informal power networks that controlled Riverside's development policies, identifying vulnerable individuals who could be influenced or controlled, and positioning herself to benefit from information that wasn't available to ordinary citizens. The Riverside Growth Alliance hadn't just been an investment group, it had been a coordination mechanism for manipulating local government decisions through a combination of financial influence and strategic use of compromising information. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was documentation showing how Mom had been using this leverage to protect our family's interests over the years. When I'd been investigating city council corruption for the press enterprise, Mom had apparently used her influence to ensure that my inquiries didn't extend to areas that might threaten the Growth Alliance's operations. When Sarah had needed favorable treatment for difficult real estate transactions, Mom had been able to coordinate solutions through her network of compromised officials. The files revealed instances where Mom had intervened in our lives without our knowledge, using her influence to smooth obstacles and create opportunities that we'd attributed to our own efforts or good fortune. My acceptance to UC Riverside had been facilitated by a recommendation from a school board member who was compromised by Mom's surveillance materials. Sarah's success in real estate had been enhanced by referrals and opportunities arranged through Mom's network of controlled business relationships. Reading through these files, I began to understand that our entire lives had been shaped by Mom's secret activities in ways we'd never suspected. The modest lifestyle she'd maintained publicly had been strategic cover for operations that required anonymity and plausible deniability. The financial constraints she'd claimed had been fictional, designed to keep us from asking questions about resources that might reveal her true activities. Even our career choices had been influenced by her need to maintain control over information and relationships that supported her business interests. The most chilling discovery was a file labeled Succession Planning that outlined Mom's strategy for transferring her operations to Sarah and me after her death. The plan involved gradually revealing our inheritance while training us to maintain the surveillance and influence networks she'd established. We were supposed to inherit not just wealth but responsibility for continuing the systematic manipulation of Riverside's political and business environment that had made that wealth possible. According to the succession planning documents, Mom had been preparing to bring Sarah into the operation directly, using her real estate connections as a foundation for expanding the Growth Alliance's influence over property development throughout the region. My journalism background was supposed to provide intelligence gathering capabilities and media influence that could protect the group's interests when their activities attracted public attention. We were intended to become the next generation of a family business built on corruption and manipulation. The documentation included detailed assessments of our personalities, skills, and potential contributions to the operation that revealed how carefully Mom had been observing and evaluating us throughout our lives. She had noted my investigative instincts and analytical abilities as assets for intelligence gathering, while identifying Sarah's social skills and relationship-building talents as perfect for expanding their network of influence. Even our career choices and personal relationships had been evaluated for their potential utility to the family's secret business interests. Sarah and I spent the rest of the evening reading through materials that systematically destroyed our understanding of the woman who had raised us. Every memory of Mom teaching us about honesty and integrity was contaminated by evidence of her sophisticated deception. Every conversation about working hard and following rules was revealed as hypocrisy designed to maintain cover for activities that violated both legal and ethical standards. The foundation of our moral education had been provided by someone who was simultaneously operating a complex criminal enterprise. Part 5. The Weight of Truth. By midnight, Sarah and I had spread the contents of Mom's safe across the basement office, creating a comprehensive map of corruption that implicated dozens of Riverside's most prominent citizens in activities ranging from influence peddling to tax evasion to outright bribery. The scope of the documentation was overwhelming, representing years of careful surveillance and intelligence gathering that had given Mom unprecedented influence over the city's political and business environment. But perhaps more disturbing than the breadth of the corruption was recognizing how completely we'd been manipulated by someone we'd trusted absolutely. The succession planning documents revealed that Mom had been observing and evaluating Sarah and me for years, not as children to be loved and guided but as potential assets to be developed for future use in her operation. She had encouraged my journalism career because she believed investigative skills would be useful for gathering intelligence on political figures and business competitors. She had supported Sarah's real estate interests because those relationships would provide cover and expansion opportunities for the Growth Alliance's activities. Every significant decision in our lives had been influenced by considerations we'd never known about. When I'd been considering job offers from newspapers in other cities, Mom had steered me toward staying in Riverside by expressing concerns about leaving family and emphasizing the value of contributing to our local community. When Sarah had been dating someone Mom considered unsuitable, she had orchestrated situations that revealed his character flaws and encouraged the relationship to end naturally. Our dating relationships, career choices, and major life decisions had all been subject to manipulation designed to align our development with her long-term operational needs. The financial record showed that Mom had been supporting both of us indirectly for years through mechanisms we'd never recognized. My mortgage approval had been facilitated by a bank executive who was compromised by Mom's surveillance materials. Sarah's real estate commissions had been enhanced by referrals from clients who were part of Mom's influence network. We'd attributed our professional successes to our own efforts, never realizing that Mom had been orchestrating advantages and removing obstacles through her control over key individuals in our community. Perhaps most disturbing was discovering documentation about our personal relationships that revealed how extensively Mom had been monitoring and manipulating our social connections. She had background checks performed on everyone we dated seriously, using private investigators to gather information about their families, financial situations, and potential vulnerabilities. When she identified relationships that might interfere with her plans or expose our family to unwanted scrutiny, she had found ways to sabotage them through strategic revelation of embarrassing information or creation of conflicts that led to natural breakups. The surveillance materials included photographs and documents about my former girlfriend Jessica, who had broken up with me 3 years ago after discovering what she claimed was evidence that I'd been unfaithful. The documentation revealed that Mom had arranged for Jessica to receive falsified evidence of infidelity, including photographs that had been digitally manipulated to show me in compromising situations with other women. The breakup had been devastating for me, but according to Mom's notes, Jessica had been considered a security risk because her father worked for the state attorney general's office and might have initiated investigations into Riverside's political corruption. Sarah discovered similar materials about her own relationships, including documentation showing how Mom had sabotaged her engagement to Marcus 2 years ago. Sarah had never understood why Marcus had suddenly become convinced that she was too career-focused to commit to marriage, but the files revealed that Mom had orchestrated a series of conversations and situations designed to create exactly that impression. Marcus had been eliminated as a potential son-in-law because his work in federal law enforcement might have exposed the family's secret activities to unwanted federal attention. The realization that our romantic relationships had been systematically manipulated by someone we trusted created a level of betrayal that went beyond discovering Mom's business activities. This wasn't just about secret wealth or political corruption, this was about fundamental violations of our autonomy and privacy that had shaped the most intimate aspects of our lives. Mom had been treating us as assets to be managed rather than children to be loved, making decisions about our happiness and future based on operational security considerations rather than our well-being. The documentation also revealed how Mom had been using our unknowing participation in her activities to gather intelligence and maintain her influence networks. When I'd interviewed city officials for newspaper stories, she had debriefed me about their responses and demeanor, looking for information that might indicate vulnerability to pressure or signs that they were aware of the Growth Alliance's activities. When Sarah had socialized with other real estate professionals, Mom had questioned her about their business practices and client relationships, gathering intelligence that could be used to identify new opportunities or potential threats. We had been unwitting intelligence assets for years, providing Mom with information and access that enhanced her ability to manipulate Riverside's business and political environment. Our professional relationships had been evaluated for their intelligence value, our social connections had been assessed for operational security implications, and our personal conversations had been mined for information that could be used to advance the Growth Alliance's interests. The trust we'd placed in Mom as our mother had been exploited to make us participants in activities we would never have knowingly supported. The succession planning documents outlined specific roles that Sarah and I were supposed to assume after being gradually introduced to the family's secret business. Sarah was intended to expand the real estate investment operation throughout Southern California, using her industry connections to identify opportunities and build relationships with developers and municipal officials in other cities. I was supposed to provide media manipulation and intelligence gathering capabilities, using my journalism background to influence public opinion and gather information about potential threats to the operation. The plan included detailed strategies for maintaining the family's public reputation while expanding their secret influence over regional development policies. We were supposed to maintain modest public profiles while secretly coordinating a network of compromised officials and business leaders across multiple jurisdictions. The goal was to create a regional power structure that could influence development decisions across Southern California, generating wealth and political influence that could be passed down to future generations. But Mom's death had disrupted the carefully planned transition process, leaving us to discover her activities through accident rather than gradual revelation. The succession planning documents suggested that she had intended to begin bringing us into the operation within the next year, starting with limited involvement in real estate investments and gradually revealing the full scope of the family's activities as we demonstrated reliability and commitment to maintaining operational security. Reading these plans, I realized that Mom had been preparing to destroy our innocence and integrity just as comprehensively as she had destroyed our understanding of her character. We were supposed to become willing participants in corruption and manipulation, trading our ethical principles for wealth and influence while maintaining the same false public personas that Mom had perfected over decades. The woman who had taught us about honesty and integrity had been planning to corrupt us into becoming criminals like herself. The weight of these discoveries created a crisis that went far beyond grief over Mom's death or shock about her secret activities. Sarah and I found ourselves confronting fundamental questions about our own identities and the validity of everything we'd believed about our family and our lives. If our entire upbringing had been performance designed to develop us into useful assets for a criminal operation, what aspects of our personalities and values were genuinely our own? How could we trust our own judgment when our entire frame of reference had been constructed by someone who was systematically deceiving us? The documentation contained enough evidence to destroy dozens of careers and potentially send multiple individuals to prison for corruption-related charges. But using that information would also expose our family's central role in the criminal activities and potentially implicate Sarah and me as unwitting participants or beneficiaries of illegal operations. We faced the choice between protecting our own interests and exposing the truth about systematic corruption that was continuing to affect our community. As dawn approached, Sarah and I sat in Mom's basement office surrounded by evidence of betrayal so comprehensive that it challenged our ability to process what we'd discovered. The woman we'd loved and trusted had been a stranger whose entire relationship with us had been manipulated for purposes we'd never suspected. Our lives had been shaped by considerations we'd never known about, our relationships had been sabotaged for reasons we'd never understood, and our future had been planned without our knowledge or consent. The decision about what to do with this information would determine not just our own futures but the futures of everyone whose illegal activities Mom had documented. We held the power to expose widespread corruption or to continue the cover-up that had protected these activities for decades. But first we had to decide whether we could live with the knowledge of who our mother really was and what she had done to the people she claimed to love. The morning after our devastating discovery in Mom's basement office, Sarah and I made the decision to confront the people whose names appeared most frequently in the surveillance files. We needed to understand the full scope of what we'd inherited and determine whether the criminal activities were ongoing or had died with Mom. The first person on our list was David Chen, the family lawyer who had been guiding us through the probate process while apparently being compromised by Mom's intelligence-gathering operation. Chen's law office occupied the entire third floor of the Riverside Commerce Building, a glass and steel structure downtown that represented the kind of modern prosperity that had transformed our city over the past 2 decades. When Sarah called to request an urgent meeting about estate matters, Chen's secretary immediately cleared his afternoon schedule, a level of accommodation that seemed excessive for routine probate questions but made perfect sense given what we now knew about his relationship with our family. The elevator ride to Chen's office gave me time to observe Sarah's emotional state, which had shifted dramatically overnight from grief and confusion to something approaching cold determination. She'd spent years building professional relationships based on trust and mutual respect, only to discover that many of those relationships had been manipulated by our mother's secret activities. The revelation had transformed her from someone who believed in the fundamental fairness of business relationships into someone who understood that power in Riverside operated according to rules she'd never been taught. Chen greeted us with the same professional warmth he'd displayed throughout the probate process, offering condolences and expressing hope that we were adjusting well to life without our mother's guidance. His office
was decorated with awards from various legal organizations and photographs showing him with prominent political figures, visual representations of the influence and respect he'd cultivated throughout his career. But knowing what we knew about his activities made these displays of professional achievement feel like elaborate theater designed to conceal corruption. Sarah took the initiative in confronting Chen, spreading several of Mom's surveillance photographs across his conference table without explanation or preamble. The photographs showed Chen accepting what appeared to be cash payments from representatives of development companies, meeting with city council members in private settings that weren't part of any official municipal business, and participating in discussions about coordinating legal strategies with political decisions. The images were clear enough that Chen's participation in questionable activities was undeniable. Chen's reaction confirmed that he understood exactly what the photographs represented and why we were showing them to him. His professional composure collapsed immediately, replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing that carefully concealed activities have been documented and could be used to destroy everything he'd built. He asked where we'd obtained the photographs and whether anyone else had seen them, questions that revealed his primary concern was limiting exposure rather than explaining or justifying his actions. I took over the conversation at that point, explaining that we'd discovered extensive documentation of his activities in Mom's files and asking him to help us understand how the system had operated while she was alive. Chen initially attempted to deny any wrongdoing, suggesting that the photographs could be misinterpreted and that his meetings with various individuals had been entirely legitimate. But when Sarah showed him copies of bank records documenting payments that coincided with specific legal actions he'd taken, his denials became impossible to maintain. The story that emerged from our conversation with Chen revealed how Mom had used her intelligence-gathering capabilities to create a network of controlled relationships that extended far beyond the Riverside Growth Alliance. She had identified vulnerabilities in key professionals throughout the city, documented their questionable activities, and then leveraged that information to secure favorable treatment for herself and her associates. Chen had been providing legal services to the Growth Alliance at below-market rates while using his influence to facilitate transactions that might not have survived scrutiny from more ethical attorneys. But Chen's cooperation with Mom hadn't been entirely voluntary. The surveillance materials included evidence of tax evasion and client fund misappropriation that could have destroyed his legal career and resulted in criminal prosecution. Mom had used this leverage to ensure Chen's loyalty, while providing him with enough business and financial benefit that the arrangement felt more like partnership than extortion. The system had been designed to make participants feel like willing collaborators rather than victims of manipulation. Chen revealed that similar arrangements existed with other professionals throughout Riverside, creating a network of compromised individuals who could be relied upon to provide favorable treatment for Growth Alliance projects. Accountants ensured that tax assessments were minimized, building inspectors expedited permit approvals, and bank executives facilitated financing for development projects that might not have qualified for conventional loans. Mom had been the central coordinator for this network, identifying targets, gathering leverage, and managing relationships that collectively gave the Growth Alliance unprecedented influence over Riverside's development policies. The conversation with Chen also revealed that the network had been evolving and expanding in recent years, with Mom working to establish similar arrangements in neighboring cities as the Growth Alliance's investment interests extended beyond Riverside's boundaries. She had been researching political structures and business relationships in other municipalities, identifying opportunities to replicate the influence network that had been so successful in controlling Riverside's development decisions. Sarah asked Chen about the succession planning documents we'd found, and whether he'd been aware of Mom's intentions to bring us into the operation. Chen confirmed that he'd been involved in structuring legal entities that would allow us to inherit Mom's assets while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods used to accumulate that wealth. The plan had been designed to give us time to adjust to our inheritance before gradually revealing the activities that had made it possible. But Chen also revealed something that the written documents hadn't made clear. Mom had been growing increasingly concerned about the sustainability of the network she'd built. Federal investigations into municipal corruption in other California cities had been getting closer to uncovering the kinds of activities that the Growth Alliance had been conducting in Riverside. Mom had been exploring strategies for liquidating assets and dissolving the network before external scrutiny could expose their activities to criminal prosecution. The revelation that Mom had been planning to end her criminal activities added another layer of complexity to our situation. If she had lived longer, we might have inherited wealth that had been legitimately separated from its corrupt origins, allowing us to benefit from her activities without becoming participants in ongoing criminal operations. Instead, her sudden death had left us in control of an active network of compromised individuals who expected continued coordination and protection from the family that had been managing their collective activities. Chen's final revelation was perhaps the most disturbing. Other members of the network were aware of Mom's death, and were expecting Sarah and me to assume her role in coordinating their activities. They had been waiting for us to make contact and provide direction about upcoming municipal decisions that could affect their investments. Our failure to reach out had been creating anxiety among network members who were concerned about exposure if the coordination system collapsed. Leaving Chen's office, Sarah and I understood that we weren't just dealing with the personal betrayal of discovering our mother's secret life. We were inheriting responsibility for managing a criminal network that included dozens of Riverside's most prominent citizens, all of whom had reasons to expect our cooperation and all of whom had information that could implicate our family in illegal activities if they decided to protect themselves by cooperating with law enforcement investigations. Part 7. The Mentor's Confession. Our next confrontation was with Tom Bradley, Sarah's real estate mentor and the man who had shaped her understanding of how business relationships operated in Riverside. The meeting took place at his office after hours, when the rest of his staff had gone home and we could speak privately about matters that could destroy his career if overheard by the wrong people.
Sarah had worked for Tom for 7 years, building her professional identity around the values and practices he'd taught her, making this conversation particularly painful for her to initiate. Tom's office reflected the success he'd achieved over 20 years in Riverside real estate, with leather furniture, original artwork, and a wall covered with awards recognizing his achievements in sales volume and community service. He built his reputation on expertise, integrity, and commitment to his clients' interests, qualities that had made him one of the most respected real estate professionals in the region. But the surveillance materials from Mom's files revealed that his success had been enhanced by coordination with the Growth Alliance and willingness to participate in activities that violated professional ethics. Sarah began the conversation by thanking Tom for the mentorship and opportunities he'd provided throughout her career, acknowledging that her success in real estate had been built on the foundation he'd established. But then she produced the surveillance photographs and financial records that documented his participation in the Growth Alliance's activities, explaining that we'd discovered these materials in Mom's estate and needed to understand how they affected our family's situation. Tom's response revealed that he'd been expecting this conversation since learning about Mom's death 3 months earlier. He'd known that her surveillance materials would eventually be discovered by someone, and he'd been preparing for the possibility that Sarah and I would confront him about activities that he'd kept hidden throughout our professional relationship. His primary concern was protecting Sarah from the consequences of his involvement with the Growth Alliance, recognizing that her career could be destroyed if her association with his activities became public knowledge. The story Tom told us revealed how Mom had recruited him into the Growth Alliance network more than 15 years ago, when he was struggling to establish his real estate business and competing against more established agencies with better connections to local developers. Mom had approached him with information about upcoming development projects and zoning changes that could benefit his clients, offering him access to intelligence that would give him competitive advantages in exchange for cooperation with the Alliance's investment strategies. The arrangement had started innocuously, with Tom simply providing information about property listings and market conditions that helped Alliance members make better investment decisions. But over time, the relationship had evolved into something more problematic, with Tom actively steering clients toward properties that benefited Alliance members and away from investments that might compete with Alliance projects. He'd been using his professional relationships to manipulate market conditions in ways that violated his fiduciary responsibilities to clients who trusted his independent judgment. Tom revealed that Mom had documented his activities from the beginning, creating evidence that could be used to destroy his career if he ever attempted to withdraw from the Alliance or failed to cooperate with their strategies. The surveillance materials included recordings of conversations where Tom had discussed manipulating property valuations, steering clients toward unfavorable transactions, and coordinating with other Alliance members to artificially inflate or deflate market prices in specific neighborhoods. But perhaps most disturbing was Tom's revelation about how Mom had used Sarah's employment at his agency to gather intelligence and influence his decisions. Sarah's natural talent for building client relationships had made her an invaluable source of information about property owners who might be vulnerable to pressure or families who were facing financial difficulties that could create investment opportunities for the Alliance. Mom had been debriefing Sarah about her client interactions without Sarah realizing that the information was being used for purposes that contradicted her professional ethics. Tom also confirmed that Sarah's rapid success in real estate hadn't been entirely due to her own abilities and efforts. Mom had arranged for Alliance members to provide referrals and opportunities that accelerated Sarah's career development, creating a track record of success that established her credibility and reputation in the local market. Sarah's achievements had been real, but they'd been facilitated by systematic manipulation of opportunities and relationships that she'd never suspected. The revelation that her career success had been orchestrated by Mom's corrupt network was devastating for Sarah, who had built her professional identity around the belief that she'd earned her achievements through hard work and competence. Learning that her mentor had been manipulating her relationships and that her mother had been using her as an unwitting intelligence asset forced her to question everything she thought she understood about her own capabilities and professional relationships. Tom's confession also revealed the scope of the Alliance's influence over Riverside's real estate market. They had been coordinating activities that affected property values throughout the city, manipulating zoning decisions and infrastructure investments to benefit their holdings while disadvantaging property owners who weren't part of their network. The cumulative effect had been to systematically transfer wealth from ordinary homeowners and small investors to Alliance members who had insider information and coordinated strategies. But Tom also provided information that hadn't been clear from the written documents we'd found in Mom's files. The alliance had been facing increasing pressure from federal agencies that were investigating municipal corruption in California cities, and Mom had been developing contingency plans for protecting network members if their activities attracted official attention. The plans included strategies for destroying evidence, coordinating alibis, and ensuring that no individual member could be pressured into providing information that would implicate others. Tom revealed that he'd been prepared to implement these contingency plans after Mom's death, assuming that Sarah and I would either continue coordinating the network or provide enough advance warning for members to protect themselves before dissolving their cooperation. Our delay in making contact had created uncertainty about whether the protection systems Mom had established were still operational, leading some alliance members to consider taking independent action to safeguard their interests. The conversation with Tom also revealed that Sarah and I weren't the only family members who had been affected by Mom's activities. Tom had knowledge of how Mom had manipulated relationships and opportunities for other families in Riverside, using her intelligence network to create advantages for some while sabotaging others based on their potential utility or threat to alliance interests. The scope of manipulation extended far beyond our immediate family to encompass much of Riverside's social and economic structure. Perhaps most chilling was Tom's revelation that Mom had been planning to recruit additional family members into the network as it expanded into neighboring cities. She'd been researching our cousins and extended family members, evaluating their skills and positions for potential usefulness in establishing alliance operations in other municipalities. The criminal network hadn't been intended as a temporary operation but as a multi-generational family business that could be expanded and passed down through inheritance. Tom's final admission was that he'd been hoping Sarah would choose to continue Mom's coordination role, believing that her natural talent for relationship building and her established position in Riverside's real estate community made her the ideal successor for managing alliance activities. He'd been prepared to provide guidance and support for her transition into the leadership role that Mom had been grooming her to assume, never considering that she might choose to reject the inheritance entirely. Part 8. The Hidden Foundation. The third confrontation took us to the home of Maria Rodriguez, our next-door neighbor for 20 years, and someone I'd considered a surrogate grandmother figure throughout my childhood. Maria had been the person who brought us soup when we were sick, watched our house when we traveled, and provided the kind of informal family support that made our neighborhood feel like a genuine community. But the surveillance materials revealed that she'd been using her position on the City Planning Commission to influence municipal decisions in exchange for financial compensation from developers and service contractors. Maria's house was a modest single-story structure that she'd owned for 30 years, maintained with the kind of meticulous care that reflected pride in homeownership and respect for neighborhood standards. Her garden was always perfectly maintained, her exterior paint was refreshed regularly, and her property represented the kind of stable long-term residency that anchored the character of our neighborhood. But knowing what we knew about her secret activities made her commitment to community appearance feel like camouflage for activities that were undermining the democratic processes that governed our city. The conversation with Maria took place in her living room, surrounded by family photographs and religious artifacts that represented the values and relationships she'd claimed were most important to her throughout the years we'd known her. Sarah and I had brought copies of the surveillance materials that documented her meetings with contractors and developers, along with bank records showing deposits that coincided with City Planning Commission votes on specific development projects. Maria's initial reaction was to deny any wrongdoing, suggesting that the photographs could be misinterpreted, and that her meetings with various business representatives had been entirely appropriate for someone in her position on the Planning Commission. But when we showed her the financial records and pointed out the correlation between payments and her voting patterns, her denials became less convincing and her demeanor shifted from confusion to resignation. The story that emerged from our conversation with Maria revealed how Mom had identified and recruited her into the Alliance network during Maria's first term on the Planning Commission 8 years earlier. Maria had been struggling financially after her husband's death, facing the prospect of losing her home due to mounting medical bills and reduced income from his pension. Mom had approached her with an offer of financial assistance in exchange for advance information about Planning Commission decisions and occasional votes that would benefit Alliance projects. What had started as a temporary arrangement to help Maria through a financial crisis had evolved into a systematic pattern of corruption that had continued for nearly a decade. Maria had been providing inside information about upcoming zoning decisions, environmental reviews, and infrastructure planning that allowed Alliance members to position themselves advantageously before information became public. In exchange, she'd received regular payments that had allowed her to maintain her home and lifestyle while providing financial security she couldn't have achieved through legitimate means. But Maria's participation in the Alliance network had gone beyond simple information sharing and vote coordination. She'd been actively advocating for development projects that benefited Alliance members while opposing proposals that might compete with their investments. Her influence on the Planning Commission had been crucial for several major developments that had generated substantial profits for Alliance members while creating negative consequences for other neighborhood residents. Maria revealed that Mom had documented her activities from the beginning, creating evidence that could be used to destroy her reputation and result in criminal prosecution if she ever attempted to withdraw from the arrangement or failed to cooperate with Alliance strategies. The documentation included recordings of conversations where Maria had discussed manipulating Planning Commission procedures, coordinating with other commissioners to influence votes, and providing confidential information to developers before it was available to the public. Perhaps most disturbing was Maria's revelation about how her corruption had affected our immediate neighborhood. She'd been using her position to influence zoning decisions and infrastructure investments in ways that benefited Alliance properties while creating problems for other residents. When neighbors had complained about traffic, noise, or environmental issues related to nearby development projects, Maria had been working to minimize official responses and prevent regulatory actions that might affect Alliance investments. The conversation with Maria also revealed how Mom had been using neighborhood relationships to gather intelligence about residents' financial situations, family circumstances, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for Alliance purposes. Maria had been sharing information about neighbors who were facing financial difficulties, family problems, or other circumstances that might create opportunities for Alliance members to acquire properties below market value or influence residents' positions on municipal issues. Maria's confession included details about how the Alliance had been systematically manipulating neighborhood dynamics to advance their investment strategies. They'd been encouraging gentrification in some areas while preventing improvements in others, based on their holdings and development plans. The cumulative effect had been to reshape Riverside's residential patterns in ways that maximized Alliance profits while displacing longtime residents who couldn't afford the changes that were being imposed on their communities. But Maria also provided information about Alliance activities that extended beyond real estate investment into other areas of municipal policy that affected residents' daily lives. She revealed that Alliance members had been influencing decisions about public transportation, utility services, and educational facilities based on how those policies would affect their property values and business interests, rather than community needs. The revelation that Maria had been betraying neighborhood trust while pretending to be a caring community member was particularly painful for me, since I'd grown up considering her an extension of our family. Learning that she'd been sharing information about our neighbors with people who intended to exploit that information for profit forced me to reconsider every interaction we'd had over the years, and question whether any of her expressions of care and concern had been genuine. Maria's final admission was that she'd been aware of Mom's surveillance activities and had been providing information that helped Mom document other people's vulnerabilities and questionable activities. The neighborhood network that I'd considered a source of mutual support and community cohesion had actually been an intelligence-gathering system that served the Alliance's interests while creating the appearance of normal social relationships. Part 9. The institutional reach. Our investigation into the Alliance network led us to schedule a meeting with Robert Kim, a Riverside City Council member whose name appeared frequently in Mom's surveillance files and who had apparently been coordinating with Alliance members on municipal decisions that affected their investments. The meeting took place in his City Hall office, a space that represented the democratic institutions and public service values that were supposed to guide local government decisions but had apparently been compromised by systematic corruption. Kim had served on the city council for 12 years, building a reputation as a thoughtful public servant who carefully considered the community impact of municipal policies before casting his votes. He'd been particularly active on issues related to urban planning and economic development, areas where his expertise and leadership had been widely respected by both colleagues and constituents. But the surveillance materials revealed that his voting patterns had been influenced by financial relationships with Alliance members that constituted clear conflicts of interest. The surveillance photographs showed Kim meeting with Alliance members in private settings where they discussed upcoming council votes and strategies for achieving outcomes that would benefit their investments. The documentation included recordings of conversations where Kim had agreed to support specific zoning changes and infrastructure projects in exchange for campaign contributions and other financial benefits that violated municipal ethics regulations. Kim's reaction to seeing the surveillance materials was different from the panic we'd observed in our previous confrontations. Instead of denying the evidence or attempting to justify his actions, he seemed relieved that the secret arrangements had finally been exposed and he could discuss activities that had been weighing on his conscience for years. His response suggested that he'd been feeling trapped by commitments he'd made to Alliance members and was grateful for an opportunity to explain how those relationships had developed. The story Kim told us revealed how Mom had approached him during his first campaign for city council 15 years earlier, offering campaign support and political expertise that had been crucial for his electoral success. At the time, Kim had been a political newcomer running against established candidates with better name recognition and more extensive fundraising networks. Mom's offer of assistance had seemed like generous community support from someone who believed in his potential for public service. But the campaign support had come with expectations that weren't made explicit until after Kim had won the election and begun his service on the city council. Mom had approached him with requests for advance information about upcoming votes and occasional support for municipal decisions that would benefit her associates' investments. The requests had been presented as opportunities to support local economic development and create jobs for Riverside residents, making them seem consistent with Kim's campaign promises and public service goals. Over time, the relationship had evolved into something that Kim recognized was inappropriate but felt unable to escape without destroying his political career and disappointing constituents who had come to rely on his representation. Mom had gradually increased her requests for cooperation while documenting his compliance in ways that could be used to expose his violations of ethics regulations if he ever attempted to withdraw from their arrangement. Kim revealed that similar relationships existed between Alliance members and other elected officials throughout Riverside's municipal government, creating a network of coordinated influence that affected virtually every major policy decision made by the city council. The Alliance had been able to shape municipal budget priorities, infrastructure investments, and regulatory policies to benefit their interests while maintaining the appearance of democratic decision-making processes. The systematic corruption of Riverside's municipal government had allowed the Alliance to secure favorable treatment for their development projects while preventing regulatory actions that might have protected community interests or environmental resources. They'd been able to obtain tax incentives, zoning variances, and infrastructure improvements that enhanced their property values while shifting costs to taxpayers who weren't aware that public resources were being used to subsidize private profits. Kim's confession also revealed how the Alliance had been manipulating electoral processes to ensure that their influence over municipal government would continue regardless of which candidates won future elections. They'd been providing campaign support to multiple candidates in each race, ensuring that whoever won would feel obligated to cooperate with their requests for favorable treatment on municipal decisions. The conversation with Kim also exposed how the Alliance's influence extended beyond Riverside into county and state government levels, where they'd been building relationships with officials who could affect regional policies that impacted their investments. Mom had been coordinating with Alliance members to influence decisions about transportation funding, environmental regulations, and economic development incentives that were made by governmental entities with jurisdiction over multiple municipalities. But perhaps most disturbing was Kim's revelation about how the Alliance had been using their influence over municipal government to retaliate against individuals or organizations that opposed their interests. They'd been able to manipulate code enforcement, tax assessments, and permit processes to create problems for people who had criticized their development projects or supported political candidates who weren't willing to cooperate with their agenda. Kim provided specific examples of how the Alliance had used municipal authority to punish opponents and reward supporters in ways that violated constitutional principles about equal treatment under law. Business owners who had opposed Alliance projects had faced intensive regulatory scrutiny and bureaucratic obstacles that made it difficult for them to operate successfully. Residents who had complained about Alliance
developments had found themselves dealing with city services problems and permit delays that created expensive complications for home improvements or business operations. The revelation that Riverside's municipal government had been systematically corrupted to serve the Alliance's private interests rather than community needs forced Sarah and me to reconsider our understanding of how democratic institutions were supposed to function. The voting processes, public hearings, and regulatory procedures that were supposed to ensure fair and transparent decision-making had been manipulated to create the appearance of democratic governance while serving the interests of a small group of connected insiders. Part 10. The Federal Connection. Our final confrontation before making our decision about how to handle Mom's legacy involved a meeting with Lisa Thompson, a federal banking regulator whose name had appeared in some of the most sensitive surveillance materials we'd discovered. The meeting took place at a coffee shop in downtown Los Angeles, far enough from Riverside to avoid attracting attention from anyone who might recognize us together. Thompson had agreed to the meeting after Sarah had contacted her using information from Mom's files, suggesting that we had materials that might be relevant to federal investigations into municipal corruption. Thompson's involvement with the Alliance Network was different from the local officials and business people we'd confronted previously. As a federal regulator, she had authority over banking policies and enforcement actions that could affect financial institutions throughout Southern California. Her cooperation with Alliance members hadn't involved direct participation in local corruption, but rather providing advance warning about federal investigations and regulatory actions that might threaten their activities. The surveillance materials revealed that Thompson had been meeting with Alliance representatives to discuss federal investigation priorities and enforcement strategies that could affect their operations. She'd been providing information about which banks were under scrutiny for suspicious transactions and which types of financial activities were attracting federal attention, allowing Alliance members to adjust their practices to avoid detection. Thompson's cooperation with the Alliance had been secured through different leverage than Mom had used with local officials. Rather than documenting compromising activities, Mom had identified Thompson's financial vulnerabilities and provided assistance that created obligations for future cooperation. Thompson had been struggling with medical bills for her daughter's chronic illness, and Mom had arranged for anonymous financial assistance that had continued for several years. But the relationship had evolved beyond financial assistance into something that compromised Thompson's professional integrity and violated federal regulations about information sharing with private parties. She'd been providing Alliance members with advance notice about federal investigations that might affect their banking relationships and regulatory actions that could impact their ability to finance development projects. Thompson's information had been particularly valuable because it allowed Alliance members to restructure their financial activities before federal agencies could identify patterns that might trigger investigations. They'd been able to modify their banking relationships, alter their transaction patterns, and adjust their business structures to avoid the kind of scrutiny that had exposed similar corruption networks in other California cities. The conversation with Thompson revealed that federal agencies had been aware of potential corruption in Riverside for several years but had been unable to gather sufficient evidence to justify intensive investigations. The Alliance's ability to adjust their activities based on Thompson's information had allowed them to stay ahead of federal scrutiny while continuing their influence over local government decisions. But Thompson also provided information that changed our understanding of the timeline and scope of Mom's activities. The Alliance network hadn't been a recent development but had been operating for over 2 decades, evolving and expanding as Mom had identified new opportunities and recruited additional participants. The wealth and influence we'd discovered represented the culmination of a long-term strategy that had been carefully developed and implemented over most of Mom's adult life. Thompson revealed that Mom had been preparing for the possibility that federal investigations would eventually expose the Alliance's activities, developing contingency plans for protecting network members and preserving as much of their accumulated wealth as possible. The succession planning documents we'd found had been part of a larger strategy for transitioning the network's operations to the next generation while maintaining the secrecy that had protected their activities from detection. The federal connection also revealed that the Alliance's influence had extended far beyond Riverside into a regional network of similar operations that were coordinating their activities across Southern California. Mom had been participating in a larger conspiracy that involved corrupt officials and business leaders in multiple cities, creating a web of influence that affected regional development policies and investment patterns. But perhaps most significantly, Thompson confirmed that federal agencies were planning to announce major corruption investigations in several California cities within the next few months, including investigations that would likely expose activities similar to what the Alliance had been conducting in Riverside. The timing meant that any decision Sarah and I made about revealing Mom's activities would occur in a context where federal attention was already focused on municipal corruption issues. Thompson's final revelation was that she'd been prepared to provide information to federal investigators about the Alliance's activities if she'd been granted immunity from prosecution for her own violations of federal regulations.
Mom's death had complicated this potential cooperation because Thompson no longer had access to current information about Alliance operations and wasn't sure whether the evidence she could provide would be sufficient to justify immunity agreements. The meeting with Thompson forced Sarah and me to recognize that our decision about how to handle Mom's legacy would have implications that extended far beyond our family or even Riverside's local community. We were holding evidence that could contribute to federal investigations affecting multiple cities and potentially expose a regional network of corruption that had been operating for decades. But we also understood that revealing the information would inevitably expose our family's central role in activities that had violated both legal and ethical standards. We faced the choice between protecting ourselves and contributing to investigations that might prevent similar corruption from continuing in other communities. The weight of that decision would determine not just our own futures but our understanding of what we owed to the community that had been systematically betrayed by people they'd trusted to serve their interests. 3 weeks after our final confrontation with Lisa Thompson, Sarah and I stood in Mom's basement office for what we knew would be the last time, surrounded by 27 years of meticulously documented corruption that had shaped our entire lives without our knowledge. The weight of what we'd discovered had transformed us from grieving children trying to honor their mother's memory into reluctant guardians of secrets that could destroy dozens of lives and expose systematic betrayal of public trust that had affected thousands of Riverside residents. The decision we faced wasn't simply about whether to reveal Mom's activities to law enforcement agencies, it was about choosing between two fundamentally different versions of who we wanted to be as human beings. We could protect ourselves and the people whose lives Mom had documented by maintaining the silence that had protected the Alliance network for over 2 decades. Or we could sacrifice our own security and potentially destroy our community's faith in its institutions by exposing the truth about how power had really operated in Riverside throughout our entire adult lives. Sarah had spent the previous 3 weeks struggling with the revelation that her entire real estate career had been built on foundations of corruption and manipulation that she'd never suspected. Every client relationship she'd developed, every professional achievement she'd earned, and every aspect of her success had been tainted by the knowledge that she'd been an unwitting participant in activities that had violated the trust of people who had relied on her expertise and integrity. The woman who had built her identity around helping families find their dream homes had discovered that she'd been part of a system that had systematically exploited those same families for profit. I had been grappling with my own professional crisis, recognizing that my journalism career had been shaped by Mom's influence in ways that had prevented me from uncovering the very corruption that should have been my responsibility to expose. The investigative instincts I'd thought were my own had been carefully channeled away from areas that might have threatened the Alliance's activities. The sources I'd trusted and the stories I'd pursued had been selected to maintain the appearance of independent journalism while ensuring that my reporting never threatened the network Mom had spent decades building. The surveillance materials contained enough evidence to support federal prosecution of dozens of individuals for corruption, fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that could result in lengthy prison sentences. Bank records documented millions of dollars in improper payments, photographs showed officials accepting bribes, and recordings captured conversations where participants explicitly discussed illegal activities. The evidence was comprehensive enough that conviction would be virtually certain for anyone whose activities had been documented in Mom's files. But using that evidence would also expose our family's central role in coordinating the criminal network and potentially implicate Sarah and me as beneficiaries of illegal activities even though we'd been unaware of their existence. Federal prosecutors might view our inheritance of wealth generated through corruption as sufficient justification for charging us with crimes, particularly given the sophisticated nature of Mom's operation and the length of time it had been active. We faced the possibility that exposing the truth might result in our own prosecution and imprisonment. The succession planning documents revealed that Mom had been preparing for exactly this scenario, developing strategies for protecting Sarah and me from legal consequences if the Alliance network was ever exposed. She'd structured our inheritance through legal entities that would provide plausible deniability about our knowledge of the source of our wealth, and she'd prepared documentation that would support claims that we'd been victims of her deception rather than willing participants in her activities. But the protection Mom had attempted to provide depended on maintaining the fiction that we'd been completely unaware of her activities until after her death. If we chose to reveal the surveillance materials to law enforcement agencies, we would be admitting knowledge that could undermine the legal protections she'd established. We might be trading the Alliance members' freedom for our own exposure to criminal prosecution. The moral complexity of our situation was compounded by recognizing that many of the people whose activities Mom had documented weren't evil individuals who had set out to become criminals. They were ordinary people who had made compromised decisions when faced with financial pressures, political ambitions, or professional challenges that had seemed to justify cutting ethical corners. Tom Bradley had been struggling to establish his business, Maria Rodriguez had been facing foreclosure, and Robert Kim had needed campaign support to serve constituents who genuinely benefited from his representation. Yet the cumulative effect of their individual compromises had been to create a system of corruption that had systematically betrayed public trust and enriched a small group of insiders at the expense of the broader community. The modest individual violations had combined into a pattern of systematic manipulation that had affected every aspect of municipal governance and economic development in Riverside for over 2 decades. Sarah and I also had to consider the impact our decision would have on the broader community we'd grown up in and still considered home. Exposing the Alliance network would inevitably destroy faith in Riverside's municipal institutions and create cynicism about democratic processes that might take generations to rebuild. Residents who had trusted their elected officials and respected business leaders would learn that their trust had been systematically betrayed by people they'd admired and supported. But maintaining the cover-up would mean allowing the systematic corruption to continue, potentially under new leadership that might be even less scrupulous than Mom had been. The Alliance network hadn't died with Mom, it had simply been waiting for new coordination that would allow its activities to resume. Other participants expected Sarah and me to assume Mom's role in managing their collective interests, and our refusal to do so might lead them to establish alternative arrangements that could be more damaging to community interests. The federal investigations that Lisa Thompson had mentioned were proceeding regardless of our decision, and it was likely that some aspects of the Alliance network would eventually be exposed through independent law enforcement activities. But the evidence we controlled could significantly accelerate those investigations and ensure that the full scope of corruption was revealed rather than just the portions that federal agencies might discover on their own. We also had to consider our responsibility to the residents whose lives had been affected by the Alliance's activities over the years. Families who had lost their homes to foreclosure might have been able to keep them if corrupt officials hadn't manipulated municipal policies to benefit Alliance investments. Small business owners who had struggled to compete might have succeeded if they hadn't been facing systematic discrimination through corrupted regulatory processes. Neighborhoods that had been gentrified might have retained their character if development decisions had been made based on community needs rather than Alliance profits. The documentation in Mom's files included enough information to support civil lawsuits that could provide compensation to residents who had been harmed by Alliance activities. Property owners who had sold at below-market prices due to manipulated conditions could recover damages. Businesses that had faced discriminatory treatment could seek compensation for lost profits. But those legal remedies would only be available if the evidence of corruption was revealed and used to support legal action against the responsible parties. After 3 weeks of agonizing deliberation, Sarah and I made our decision during a conversation that lasted until sunrise on a Tuesday morning in July. We sat in Mom's basement office surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal and acknowledged that we couldn't live with ourselves if we chose personal protection over community justice. The people of Riverside deserved to know the truth about how their city had been governed, and the victims of Alliance activities deserved an opportunity to seek compensation for the harm they'd suffered. But we also decided that we wouldn't simply turn the evidence over to law enforcement agencies and hope for the best. We would take active responsibility for ensuring that the truth was revealed in ways that maximized accountability while minimizing harm to innocent people who had been tangentially involved in Alliance activities. We would work with federal investigators to provide evidence that supported prosecution of the most serious violations while protecting individuals whose participation had been minimal or coerced. Our decision meant accepting that our lives in Riverside would be permanently changed and that we would face legal, financial, and social consequences that we couldn't fully predict. But it also meant choosing to live with integrity rather than complicity, even when integrity came with substantial personal costs. We would honor the values Mom had taught us in words by rejecting the example she had provided through her actions. Part 12. The controlled burn. The process of revealing the Alliance network's activities began with a carefully orchestrated meeting with federal investigators who had been monitoring municipal corruption throughout Southern California. Sarah and I had contacted the FBI field office in Los Angeles through an attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection, ensuring that our cooperation would be structured in ways that provided some legal protection while maximizing the value of the evidence we could provide. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Los Angeles with lead investigators Special Agent Patricia Reeves and two other agents who had been working corruption cases in multiple California cities. We brought copies of the most significant surveillance materials from Mom's files along with financial records and correspondence that documented the scope of the Alliance Network's activities over more than 2 decades. Agent Reeves confirmed that federal agencies had been aware of potential corruption in Riverside but had been unable to gather sufficient evidence to justify the intensive investigations that would be necessary to expose systematic violations. The evidence we provided would allow them to seek search warrants and subpoenas that could uncover additional documentation while building cases against individuals whose activities we'd documented. But the investigators also explained that our cooperation would inevitably become public knowledge once prosecutions began, exposing us to retaliation from Alliance members and scrutiny from media outlets that would be covering the corruption scandal. We would need to prepare for the possibility that our entire lives would be examined by journalists, investigators, and community members trying to understand our family's role in the activities that were being exposed. The federal investigation moved quickly once it began, with search warrants executed simultaneously at dozens of locations throughout Riverside and neighboring cities. The coordinated raids targeted Alliance members' homes and offices, municipal buildings where compromised officials worked, and financial institutions where corrupt transactions had been processed. The scope of the operation was unprecedented in Riverside's history, involving more than 50 federal agents and generating immediate media attention that transformed our quiet suburban city into the center of a major corruption scandal. Sarah and I watched the news coverage from a hotel room in San Diego, having been advised to leave Riverside temporarily while the initial investigations were conducted and Alliance members were arrested. The images of respected community leaders being led away in handcuffs were surreal, particularly when we recognized people we'd known throughout our lives as neighbors, family, friends, and trusted professionals. The corruption scandal was destroying the public reputation of individuals we'd grown up admiring, including some who had genuinely tried to serve community interests despite their compromised decision-making. Tom Bradley was among the first arrests, charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy related to his manipulation of real estate transactions and coordination with Alliance development projects. The news coverage showed him being escorted from his office by federal agents while former clients and colleagues watched in shock. Sarah's professional reputation was inevitably affected by the revelation of her mentor's criminal activities, even though federal investigators had cleared her of any knowing participation in Alliance operations. Maria Rodriguez was charged with bribery and conspiracy for her role in manipulating City Planning Commission decisions, with prosecutors citing the extensive documentation Mom had compiled about her activities over nearly a decade. The news coverage emphasized her betrayal of public trust and the impact her corruption had on municipal decision-making that affected every Riverside resident. Her arrest was particularly painful for us to witness, given her role as our neighbor and surrogate family member throughout our childhood. Robert Kim faced the most serious charges due to his central role in coordinating Alliance influence over municipal government decisions. Federal prosecutors had used Mom's surveillance materials to build a comprehensive case documenting his participation in systematic corruption that had affected virtually every major policy decision made by Riverside City Council during his 12-year tenure. His arrest generated extensive media coverage about the breakdown of democratic institutions and the betrayal of voter trust by elected officials. David Chen was charged with multiple violations related to his professional misconduct as an attorney, including fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that could result in both criminal penalties and permanent loss of his law license. The legal profession's disciplinary processes would proceed independently of criminal prosecution, ensuring that Chen would face consequences through multiple channels for his violations of professional ethics and legal obligations. Lisa Thompson's cooperation with federal investigators had resulted in immunity agreements that protected her from prosecution in exchange for testimony about the Alliance Network's activities and information about similar corruption in other cities. Her willingness to testify had been crucial for building cases against other participants, but it had also exposed her own violations of federal regulations and ended her career in government service. The media coverage of the corruption scandal inevitably focused on our family's role in the Alliance Network, with journalists struggling to understand how Elena Martinez, a modest school secretary, had been able to coordinate such an extensive criminal operation while maintaining a public facade of humble respectability. The contrast between Mom's public persona and her secret activities became a central narrative in news stories about the scandal, with reporters examining how systematic deception had been possible in a small city where everyone was supposed to know their neighbors. Sarah and I were portrayed as reluctant whistleblowers who had discovered their mother's criminal activities and chosen to cooperate with federal investigators despite the personal costs of exposing their family's involvement. The media narrative emphasized our shock at learning about Mom's double life and our decision to prioritize community justice over family loyalty. But we also faced criticism from some community members who viewed our cooperation with federal investigators as betrayal of people who had been part of our extended social network. The financial consequences of our decision were substantial and immediate. The assets we'd inherited from Mom were frozen pending investigation into their origins and potential forfeiture as proceeds of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors were required to pursue asset forfeiture for wealth generated through illegal activities regardless of whether current owners had been aware of criminal origins. We faced the possibility of losing everything we'd inherited while still being responsible for legal fees and other costs associated with the investigation. But the civil lawsuits that followed criminal prosecutions created opportunities for victims of alliance activities to seek compensation that might not have been available through criminal cases alone. Property owners who had been forced to sell at below market prices due to manipulated municipal policies filed suit against alliance members and the city government. Small business owners who had faced discriminatory treatment through corrupted regulatory processes sought damages for lost profits and destroyed opportunities. The lawsuits also revealed additional victims whose suffering hadn't been apparent from the criminal evidence we'd initially provided. Elderly residents who had been pressured into selling their homes to alliance-connected developers testified about intimidation tactics and fraudulent representations that had cost them their life savings. Families who had been displaced by gentrification described how their communities had been systematically destroyed by development projects that prioritized alliance profits over neighborhood stability. The scope of harm caused by the Alliance Network's activities exceeded what Sarah and I had anticipated when we decided to reveal Mom's materials to federal investigators. The systematic nature of the corruption had affected virtually every aspect of municipal governance and community development for over 2 decades, creating wounds that would require years to heal and trust that might never be fully restored. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.